Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Epic Wednesdays. This is a world's finest event in which Michael K. Captain Koloff Vaughan and I combine the forces of stately Vaughan Manor and Hyde Cottage to examine Marvel Comics' Epic Collection. This is a reprint volume of paperbacks in full color of different runs and arcs of their canonical titles going back 50 years. This is not strictly chronological, the way, for instance, the Marvel Masterworks series is. Instead, you can jump around, which means that Marvel is free to serve up particularly favorite popular arcs. They're also free, from a mercantile point of view, to serve up arcs that inform their cinematic efforts. If you've got an arc that makes sense of an upcoming movie, that might get pulled to the head of the pile. And those things can be preferred over lesser-known arcs or less popular arcs on the same runs of the same characters. It can make for a little bit of a confusing reading experience, but eventually Marvel plans to get around to everything in the Epic Collections. And as a result, the lineup of Epic Collections that you see now are going to have distinctly uneven entries. And Michael K. Vaughan is leading the choices here. He has 10 times more Epic Collections than I do. And today he has chosen an Epic Collection volume that is one that commemorates, that immortalizes, that combines and reprints a less than stellar run on one title, on one character. He's chosen this. The God of Thunder is the Epic Collection that collects the beginning adventures of the character Thor that, thanks to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, everybody knows now. This starts when these issues are taken from when Thor first appeared. Thor did not have a first issue. He appeared as a feature in a comic book called Journey into Mystery. And that's what this volume reprints. This volume reprints Journey into Mystery 83 to 109. You might think that's a lot of issues. Yeah, because Thor only had 10 pages in each issue at first. They weren't full-size comic books. And it starts with Thor's origin story, as Stan Lee liked to do. It starts off with milquetoast American doctor Donald Blake vacationing in Norway. And he finds a wooden cane in a cave, and he bashes it against the walls of the cave, as one does. And in a blast of light, he is transformed into Thor, the Norse god of thunder, and the cane is transformed into Thor's hammer. And there's an alien invasion of Earth going on, the Stone Men of Saturn, who you might think are such a lame invention, they never reappear, but they do, and they get a reappearance. And Thor is needed. The power of Thor is needed to defend the Earth, to fight the Stone Men of Saturn off. And that kicks off Thor's adventures. But that first issue asks as many questions as it answers. It's not an origin story in the sense that we would really understand it today. For instance, number one, we don't know who Thor is. Is it Donald Blake? It certainly seems like it. When he's standing there lifting boulders over his head, he's commenting on how, wow, I have all sorts of strength that a few minutes ago I didn't have, which is not something that Thor, the God of Thunder, would say. And if, on the other hand, you think, well, okay, maybe Thor is just surprised to be alive again, so if in that case, who is Donald Blake? It's an age-old question for people who bought these first issues. It's an age-old question, because a lot of comic book fans were familiar with Captain Marvel. Not any of the characters that have appeared since that name, but the original Captain Marvel, who was a little boy named Billy Batson, who, when he says the magic word Shazam, transforms into a character called Captain Marvel, who is an adult man, and superpowered, and very much not Billy Batson. I read Captain Marvel comics forever and ever, and I always enjoyed them, but I always had the same question. Who is Captain Marvel? Where is he when Billy Batson is Billy Batson? And at first, the very first conception that Stan Lee had of the character Thor carried over a lot of those questions. Who is Thor? Why is it just that Donald Blake is transformed into, I don't know, some sort of approximation of what Thor might be? Like a circus that has a strongman they call Hercules? Eventually, in the course of these issues, Stan Lee fixes those problems. This is very much another character where he needed time to get his feet underneath him, needed time to figure out what the best approach to this character was. And he realized right away what Michael K. Vaughan points out in his video, which is that the best approach to this character is to make him Thor, the Norse god of thunder, to introduce fantasy into what is primarily Stan Lee's science fiction view of the world. So Thor becomes the son of Odin, the brother of Loki, the prince of Asgard. And Asgard and Thor, or Loki and Odin and a whole bunch of other Asgardian characters suddenly enter into Marvel continuity. They aren't ye old-timey figures. They aren't figures from the age of mythology. We are suddenly introduced to a Marvel universe in which Asgard, the home of the Norse gods, exists in the present day with skyscrapers and lampposts. It exists. The Norse gods exist. For some reason, they no longer interact in the mortal world, but they are still around. They are real beings, not theology, but fantasy. And that works really well. I'll leave a link to Michael's video down below. He shows that in addition to that, Stan Lee introduced a backup feature called Tales of Asgard, in which he just gets to tell mythology, just pure epic high fantasy about the realm of Asgard. First, just retailing Norse myths that he read in Bullfinch's mythology, but then incorporating a younger Thor, a younger Loki, incorporating the characters to show that this Thor is, in fact, thousands of years old and existed in mythological times and fought with ice giants and giant serpents and trolls and gnomes and whatnot. That still leaves the question of who is Donald Blake, and how on earth Thor can be channeled, so to speak, through mortal man. Why he would be. The true origin story of Thor, in other words, isn't told for a long time. It certainly isn't told in this volume. You just have to roll with that and get Thor's initial adventures, where he fights with Radioactive Man and the Cobra and Mr. Hyde, a contortionist and a circus strongman, where he fights with the Grey Gargoyle, who can turn people to stone for an hour, and as Michael points out, gangsters as well, and a hokey magician who calls himself Merlin and whatnot. And you can tell by my tone of voice and by the expression on my angelic face that these issues are not generally successful. You get Jack Kirby's artwork to start with, then Kirby goes away for a while, and some ringers are brought in, including a couple of artists who occasion Michael K. Vaughan's two heresies. In his own video on this book, he commits heresy twice in his video. The first of his heresies is to look at the issue of Journey into Mystery that's drawn by Al Hartley, an Archie comics artist, a true love, teen love comics artist, someone not cut out for superhero comics at all. It was just a workhorse, never missed a deadline, and was needed because there was a hole in the roster, that's all. Michael K. Vaughan points to his issue, in which the artwork is atrocious. I'm not contesting that. And says that it is, in his opinion, probably the worst artwork ever to appear in a Golden Age Marvel comic. When Michael K. Vaughan has, I am sure, not one, not two, but a whole shelf of epic collections reprinting the Hulk artwork of Herb Trimpe. And yet he has the gall to call Al Hartley the worst Golden Age artist ever to see print. We'll get to Herb Trimpe. I'm sure that we will. If Michael's willing to put me through this volume, then he's willing to put me through Herb Trimpe Hulk volumes. But he also, in addition to that, when talking about the ringers brought in on Thor, he also commits his second heresy when he talks about another old workhorse artist, Don Heck, who's yards and yards better than Al Hartley. Yards and yards better. Who's brought in for, I think, a couple of issues of Thor, and they aren't particularly good, but in terms of layout, conception, action, anatomy, they're yards and yards better than Al Hartley. But that's not the heresy. Michael K. Vaughan's second heresy is to make an offhand aside that Don Heck might have been pretty good in his run on Iron Man, but that he was no great shakes in his run on the Avengers. His run on the Avengers is incredible. It is fantastic. And I know that despite the fact that Michael Vaughan said that, he has those volumes. In Epic Collections, Marvel Masterworks, you name it. I'm sure that he has tons of Don Heck artwork at Stately Vaughan Manor. So we'll be getting to it. You can be your own judge. Fortunately, his video only had the 2 heresies. And then Jack Kirby comes back to the comic. And for a while, he gets a really good inker, an inker that I wish he'd had more often. Chick Stone inks him in a great story in which Thor tells a bunch of kids his version of his fight with the Hulk. There's a 2-panel thing that happens in the Avengers where it looks like the Hulk and Thor are going to fight. It was, even then, 50 years ago, the only superhero fight that Marvel fans wanted to see. But we don't really get that in that issue of the Avengers, and Thor sort of revisits it and gives you a whole Hulk fight, a whole fight between him and the Hulk. It's an interesting gimmick because he's talking to children, first of all, and also, well, he's Monday morning quarterbacking. It's not, in other words, a reliable narrator. It's one of the combatants talking about how the fight went. But nevertheless, the artwork's terrific, and the Tales of Asgard backup feature also gets much better. Starts to find its feet. I would argue that Tales of Asgard found its footing a lot quicker than Stan Lee's handling of Thor himself. Because, as Michael K. Vaughan points out, the problem here is that aside from Loki, Thor is confronted with mostly second-rate villains. And that means everything. Your villains mean everything in a superhero comic. And it'd be a while before that started to change. And it largely started to change as Stan Lee incorporated the Asgardian fantasy elements into Thor's normal adventures. So there wasn't a backup feature only where you would find the high fantasy of Asgard, where you would find that bleeding over into Thor's comics. So that longtime fans used to... I'm a longtime fan of Thor. I didn't start regularly collecting his comic until it changed names, until it became The Mighty Thor. Mainly because I was thrown off by the crappy production value that is immortalized in this volume. But longtime Thor fans used to point out that Stan Lee had a sort of a rhythm involved, where Thor would embark on an epic, cosmic, mythological, Asgardian adventure, and then he would come back to Earth and have have some Earthbound adventures, and then it would happen again. And that pattern stayed true for decades. Decades, that was the case. And I always preferred the high fantasy more. It always struck me as more believable. I know this will be a heresy of my own, but it always struck me as a little unbelievable that Thor would pal around with the Avengers at all. I've mentioned this before in connection with the Avengers title instead of with Thor, but there's no one on the team that can approach him in levels of power. It very seldom happens in an Avengers comic that the team will be facing something, and if you take a step back, you ask yourself, okay, let's just think about this logically. Could Thor handle this on his own? There's very seldom a circumstance in which the answer isn't yes. The writers of the Avengers had to come up with all sorts of hokey, unbelievable methods to depower Thor or take him out of action for a while in order to give the rest of the team, anything to do. But then again, that taps into a besetting problem with Thor's own comic, which is you've got not only a god having adventures on Earth, but a whole race of gods who are just one dimensional portal away, just one rainbow bridge away from having adventures on Earth. That starts to open up a can of worms that I'm not sure Stan Lee really saw. I'm not sure he really saw the narrative problems that he was creating with this book, but nevertheless, that doesn't change the fact that Michael Vaughan has once again picked a loser, a wicked pissa loser, as we say in South Boston, for the Epic collections. Now, he mentions in his video, this is not, I promise, I shouldn't promise, because you're all bloodthirsty little wombats, but I promise these videos are not going to be just a case of Michael K. Vaughan and I disagreeing. We largely agree on this volume, that it's mostly a hit or miss affair, that the Tales of Asgard are the best things in it, and that most of the rest of it is very, very scattershot, including some dog things that I don't think you'd buy even as a collector. The Carbon Copy Man, for instance. But there are others, too. That Merlin issue is awful. The only real disagreement that we have here is on whether or not to own this thing. Michael K. Vaughan owns it. I would not. I would not own it. I would not take it out of a little free library if I saw it. One way or another, we aren't always going to disagree, but we'll have to see what next week brings, because he's already mentioned. In addition to these Epic Wednesdays and these World's Finest Team-Ups, he's also reading all of the X-Men. And the X-Men, needless to say, have been a very popular subject for the Epic reprint line. Thor has also been very popular. There have been very, very many collections of Thor. But his our next Epic collection, our next World's Finest Wednesday, will be about the X-Men. I don't know specifically which he's going to do, because it's hard to tell. If you say, I'm going to do the first X-Men Epic collection, well, do you mean the Epic collection covering reprinting their first adventures, or the Epic collection that was the first one of theirs that was done? Those won't be the same thing. I'll be ready. In any case, I'll be ready. I will be ready to take a trip to Westchester, to the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters, and we will see what Michael Vaughan has to say about it. But in the meantime, for today, I'm going to suggest to you that even if you're a Thor fan, you might want to spare yourself $35 for the God of Thunder. This particular Thor Epic Collection doesn't have enough good stuff in it to warrant your attention. There are some Thor Epic Collections that contain some of the best stuff that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee ever did together. I believe that they achieved their greatest rapport as artist and writer on Thor with this character. It's just a very rocky start. That's all. So there's your Epic of Wednesday collection, and I'm going to wrap this up, and we'll meet next Wednesday and see what Michael K. Vaughan has in store for us. Thank you, Bertie.